As you know, Mr. President, we recently passed some legislation that notes that March is Women's History Month. So in light of that, Mr. President, I wanted to speak about one of my favorite historic people. So, Mr. President, in the 1700s, 249 years ago, Abigail Adams lived. Now, to remind you about Abigail, she was the husband of John Adams. John Adams was our first vice president under President George Washington, and he was our second president of the U.S. But during the time I'm going to speak of, he was actually the Massachusetts delegate to the Constitutional Congress. And Abigail and John were very close. They had a very respectful marriage, very loving marriage, and they wrote lots of letters to each other. Of course, in those days, there was no telephone, right? So John is off now. He's in Boston for the Constitutional Congress, and she wrote a famous letter to him. Quoted many times, the three words are quoted from it: "Remember the ladies." But, Mr. President, there was a lot more to that letter. So, permission to read a paragraph from that letter, Mr. President.
Without objection.
Thank you. So Abigail wrote this to her husband, John Adams, delegate to Continental Congress: "Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men will be tyrants if they could." I pause for emphasis, Mr. President. "If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have had no voice or representation." End quote. Mr. President, she was the first to really verbalize the emphasis on the right to vote. Abigail was very unique. In those days, women could not own any property. Even though their fathers may have willed it to them, it went into the possession of their husbands. Now, if the husband died, then the wife could take possession. While John was gone, she was left in charge of their home and their property, and she actually bought additional property on her own. She also had an investment advisor. Incredible in those days, Mr. President. And she invested in various things, mainly property and businesses. She imported goods from Europe and sold them at a profit. So she actually became very wealthy, or rather her husband became very wealthy as a result of her efforts. She was unique in this: she bequeathed her possessions to her granddaughters, something that was very unusual and probably didn't hold much of a force of law, but it made a point that Abigail meant to make. Her statement about fomenting a rebellion was actually executed 72 years later. When the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 was held, this was the first women's rights convention, Mr. President. 65 years later, in 1913, Alice Paul led the first women's suffrage march in Washington, D.C. on March 3rd of 1913. A few weeks later, on March 21st, Alaska passed a law, the Territory of Alaska passed a law granting women's rights to vote, women's suffrage. Mr. President, this is Women's History Month, and throughout the month, there are several of us that will be highlighting Alaska women who have led the way in leadership and women's rights. Thank you, Mr. President.